Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to welcome you to this final session of the Houston Seminar's Historical Structures of Racism in Houston course, entitled Policing and the Criminal Justice System, Disparities and Reform. My name is Liz Crowell, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Houston Seminar. Our session today will be conducted in the Zoom meeting format, so please remember to mute your microphones when not speaking. If you have questions or comments during today's session, we'll be addressing them at the end of our presentation. You may type a question or comment using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, or simply raise your hand at the appropriate time. I'd like to remind you that today's session will be recorded and will be available for later viewing by subscribers to the class. Our speaker today, and today being the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd, is Dr. Howard Henderson, who is the founding director of the Center for Justice Research, a professor of justice administration in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University, and a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Henderson is an expert on culturally responsive criminal justice research, program evaluation, and predictive bias. An equity-focused criminologist, his research takes a systems-based approach to understanding policy and program effects and has demonstrated the inability of current policy and programming to remain race neutral, in effect negatively impacting historically disenfranchised communities. Dr. Henderson's research has provided approaches to reducing disparities in the criminal justice system and within its risk assessment instruments. His research on predictive bias and program evaluation has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Justice. Recently, Dr. Henderson served as the chair of the Data Subcommittee for Houston's Racial Ethnic Disparities Committee Data Workgroup, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. And he serves as an advisor to local, state, and federal legislators and to a host of criminal justice agencies, along with reform-oriented organizations. Dr. Henderson's most recent research has appeared in Race and Justice, Journal of Criminal Justice and Behavior, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and the American Medical Association's Journal of Ethics. His scholarship has been published in the Huffington Post, the Houston Chronicle, and the Texas Tribune. He was awarded the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences Minority Mentor of the Year in 2019. Howard has appeared on CNN, Fox, NBC, CNBC, ABC, the Black News Channel, Houston Public Media, and the Laura Coates Show. His research has been cited by Politico, Vice, Al Jazeera, Yahoo News, and the Crime Report. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard Henderson.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this opportunity to have a discussion with you all today. Liz and Marta, I appreciate the welcome and the introduction to your organization. I think it's necessary in all communities, and hopefully I will say something today that will spark a conversation for us to move this criminal justice system forward. One of the things that we know is that 80% of the criminal justice system is local. Though most of the conversation tends to focus on the national narrative, if we don't understand what's happening in our community, we're unable to change it and make meaningful solutions moving forward. As Liz stated, she laid out so eloquently the work that I have been able to work on and do, but I would be remiss if I didn't, pay homage to the team of people that I'm able to work with every day at a university that provides me an opportunity to ask the tough questions, but to also provide solutions to problems that have been existing since this country began. I want to start out before we move into kind of giving an idea of what criminal justice looks like in the city of Houston, what policing looks like in the city of Houston and around this country, but also looking at solutions. And ultimately, we'll conclude with a call to action that I think if we all can adopt and move forward, we would reduce disparities, but also improve public safety in our criminal justice system. If we can, at this point, I'd like to show a quick 3-minute video to kind of give an idea of the space within which I'm able to operate in.
The Center for Justice Research, initiated on the campus of Texas Southern University in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs, produces nationally recognized, culturally responsive, evidence-supported solutions for the criminal justice system.
The Center for Justice Research is focused on reducing mass incarceration with culturally responsive, evidence-based approaches.
It's very important that we have evidence-based data at the center. This is very important for policy recommendations and in order to make change.
Our research serves local, state, and national stakeholders by ensuring that they have the most proven approaches to dismantling mass incarceration and for achieving the overall best social outcomes.
The research we are doing not only identifies problems, we are also trying to make sure that we come up with solutions.
Through our research, strategic outreach program, academic seminars, workshops, and our purposeful utilization of academic association meetings, we support and motivate key social actors and institutions.
Well, recently we partnered with Measure Austin to create a big data community policing training to look at some of the issues about how we are better able to improve relationships between the police and the community.
It impacts everybody. It starts on an individual basis, but then it spreads into the community as well into the nation.
We also serve as the only criminal justice research center focused on increasing diversity among justice-oriented researchers with our development program.
It brings more awareness not only to our campus, but to minorities, Black or Latino students.
Our team has years of collective research experience, which we use to turn data into solutions.
In today's society, data is very important, and it helps people to understand what is taking place.
We select our projects after careful deliberations on the most pressing criminal injustices in the area of police-community relations, prosecutorial decision-making, and algorithmic bias.
The importance of being a part of an organization that is nonpartisan is that we're able to remain neutral. We can eliminate all the bias and just focus on simply what the data says.
Each of our projects is vetted through a multi-stage internal and external review process, which includes respected researchers, policymakers, agency heads, advocacy groups, and key members of the community.
2.5 years ago, we pulled together some of the brightest minds that we could find to begin to provide evidence-based approaches.
I'm proud of being part of this organization, one of the few organizations that helps to advance Black faculty.
Thanks. And what that is, just to provide an overview of where I situate the work that we do. And this opportunity to have today's conversation is one that we look for at every turn, because I think that having conversation with groups like this, we're able to learn and grow as well as share information about what we know. If we can move to the first slide, if you don't mind. And as we walk through this slide, I don't want to focus so much on the details, but I want to paint the picture of what this looks like and where we are in the city of Houston. You know, given the recent deaths of George Floyd, Philando Castile, Alton Smith, and others, due to excessive force at the hands of the police, a national debate has sparked over race and police use of force. Unease, dissatisfaction, anger, and frustration were evident over the disparate policing and incarceration of persons of color, particularly African Americans. Despite the rise in violent crime, Black males in this country are 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police than anyone else. Inequalities are further reflected in traffic stops, drug arrests, prison populations, and the indirect impact of family, friends, and community. There have been several explanations that we could go on and on about why this exists, but today I want to be able to talk to you about structural and historical explanations that provide an understanding of the differential enforcement of the criminal justice system at the hands of many poor and disenfranchised communities. And I'll walk you through what we've been able to glean through our research, through our association with multiple organizations and partnerships in the city of Houston, in the state of Texas, as well as around the country. If you could go to this initial slide, take a look at what you see here. We know for a fact that Blacks are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested than anyone else. Latinos are almost 1.25 times more likely to be arrested than anyone else. If you could go to the next slide for me. What you see here in the next slide is there is a problem at the county level. You go to the next slide, please. Not sure if the next slide. Okay, there you go. Thank you. What does this look like in Houston and Harris County? And the reason you're going to hear some conversation today about Harris County, some conversation about Houston, it depends upon the availability of the data. Sometimes they don't differentiate between the two, and we'll do as best we can to mention Harris County versus the city of Houston. In Harris County, despite only representing 20% of the county, Blacks are represented at every stage of the process, at every offense type, except DWIs. Now, I also want to make a note that Harris County leads the country in the number of DWI deaths, which is an issue that we'll talk briefly about, but I think we should understand where we are and what we're situated around if we understand the criminal justice system. So this just paints a picture of the types of arrests that we encounter, understanding that racial disparities exist at every major point for every major offense except DWIs. And so I want you to understand that context before we move forward. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, when you look at arrests to county jail, who makes it to the county jail, for what do they make it to the county jail? If you look at every year going back to 2011, you'll see that Blacks are represented at every phase, at every year going back almost 10 years. What we're going to do today is why is this happening and how do we solve that problem? Next slide, please. Now, we spent some time with the Houston Police Department right after George Floyd, and we wanted to understand what was happening, what people testing, and in this conversation of police accountability. If you look there, you'll see the trend lines for citizens killed by the police relative to race, white, Black, and Hispanic being the 3 major ones. The other groups were so small, many of them non-existent in police shootings. What you'll find is that only recently have you seen whites and Blacks show a reversal of response, a reversal of being killed by the police, where now you actually see, for the most recent year, you see more whites being killed by the Houston Police Department than anyone else. And this conversation begs the question, why? We are in conversations now with the police department trying to understand what's happening, but this is counter to what you see in most places around the country. This is counter to the common narrative around the country. Houston has the unique experience of being one of the largest cities that does not have an extreme racial disparity in the number of people killed by the police in the most recent year. Going back prior to the most recent year of 2019, you see a reversal of their reality. You see a disparity, and again, we can talk about that as we move forward, and I kind of talk about what we have been able to do at the Center for Justice Research and having a conversation with the police department, as well as the community about what's happening there. Can you move forward for me, please? Next slide. Now, over recent years, the city of Houston has been brought up on charges of racial disparity, as well as an overinflated jail population. They went through a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and they began to focus on who it was that they were incarcerating prior to conviction. And as a result of that, Houston responded and racial disparities, as well as reduced the jail population. Can you next slide, please? In this slide, you will see a breakdown of individuals numerically as they exist in the county jail relative to rates, okay? In the Harris County Jail, the highest rate of individuals are Black, obviously. But you also see an almost even split between whites and Hispanics in the Harris County Jail, keeping in mind African Americans only represent about 20% of Harris County. Can we go next slide, please? Now, the whole debate around the county has been whether or not we are incarcerating people before trial only because they're unable to pay bail. If you look at the state legislature at this point, this most recent session, a lot of the conversation was about whether or not poor people should be able to post bail. The conversation also revolved around whether or not violent offenders should be released from the county jail. And we're in that quagmire between releasing people because of their inability to pay bail and also releasing violent offenders in the community who may harm individuals. I will say this, the research has been very clear that violent offenders have a low rate of recidivism. We know that. Violent offenders are very likely to not reoffend. There are the exceptions. The problem is in those exceptions, if they happen to harm someone, then it makes national news. Someone may be dead, someone may be seriously hurt. We have not figured out how to deal with that yet as a society, even though the Constitution says that every individual has a right to bail. We're still trying to deal with that and figure out how to respond accordingly. Next slide, please. As you look here, when we analyze the individuals that are actually in the Harris County Jail, 3 out of 4 of those individuals have not been to court yet. They have not been convicted of a crime. And we understand what that means. 75% of those folks are felonies. And ultimately, 75% of those individuals in the Harris County Jail are either Black or Hispanic, or Latinx as we refer to them now. But the challenge here is we don't know as a county how to deal with them just yet because the numbers are so large. We've been unable to process them through the system because they're being incarcerated so rapidly. Let's go to the next slide if you don't mind. Again, what I'm doing here is just giving us an idea of what the county looks like so that we can kind of talk about some of the solutions that we've been able to help the county move forward with. Next slide, please. What you're going to see here is a national incarceration rate so that I can show you a comparison between where Harris County is relative to the country. The highest rate of incarceration around the country are among Blacks in this country. Next slide, please. Just to show you where Harris County is. Now, what you see here is in the state of Texas, African Americans or Blacks have the highest percentage of its population housed in prison, but I do this here to make a point. What you see here are the percentages of each racial group in the state that happen to be incarcerated. And what you see now is you only see 2% of Blacks, 0.3% of whites, and 0.5% of Hispanics incarcerated in the state of Texas. Now, you may say, well, hey, this is very small. Oftentimes, we never think about this, right? We never think about the small number of a population that are actually incarcerated. The research tells us that 6% of any particular group in any community are responsible for the majority of the crime. So we live in this space where fear kind of guides us and makes us think that crime is worse than it is. The reality of it is there's a very small percentage of individuals who are responsible for the lion's share of crime in the community. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at, from incarceration, let's look at community alternatives. What do we do with individuals that we feel are able to function in society, but they still need some level of supervision. Can we go next slide, please? At this decision point, you also see racial disparity. Now, we've been through arrest, we've been through conviction, we've been through sentencing, we've been through pretrial diversion. Now we're looking at community supervision. What you find at this level, you also see racial disparity again. You see Blacks almost 3 times more likely to be placed on probation and almost 4 times more likely to receive parole. Now, at every decision point, as I walk you through this phase, you're seeing racial disparity. Next slide, please. Now, again, what we do here is to show you what percentage of each racial group may actually be on parole and or probation. Again, very small percentage. Obviously, it seems as if that number is much higher than it really is, but in reality, we're talking about a small percentage of the population being responsible for a significant majority of the crime. Next slide, please. What you see here on this next slide will be the composition as you see it in Harris County. As you know, for those individuals that are on probation in the county, the majority of them are white for misdemeanor and felonies. Just have an idea of what we're looking at from a racial ethnic standpoint in the county. This essentially shows you that ultimately on any given year, there are about 70,000 people that are on probation in Harris County. Next slide. Now, again, I walk you through that fairly briefly just to get an idea of where we were in this county, what crime looks like, what the disparity looks like, where we are in this space. Now, next slide, I'm going to show you what we were able to do working with several research entities around the country. Next slide, please. Here's a project that we worked on with Gallup. And what we wanted to do is figure out what Houstonians thought about the criminal justice system, what they thought about the police, so that we have an idea of where Houston stands in relationship to the rest of the country. And what we found is that Houstonians, for the most part, tended to have a more positive view of the police than the rest of the country, which is a good thing, right? It tells you that there's positive interaction between the police and the community. Again, this is a likelihood of them experiencing the police more positively than the rest of the country. What we see is that Houstonians tend to have a more favorable view of the police than most individuals around the country. They also have more respect for the police, which tells us that the police are doing something right. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to have your pockets around the city that don't view the police as favorably, but this means that you have pockets in the majority of the city that actually feels the police are doing their job, they're being respectful, and they have confidence in the police, which is a positive thing. Next slide, please. We recognize that there was a problem with violent crime around the country. And we wanted to understand what it was that was motivating individuals to be involved in violent crime, particularly gun possession, because we understood that gun possession was a precursor to gun violence. So what we went out and we wrote a proposal to examine gun violence in 4 cities: Houston, Texas, Jackson, Mississippi, Baltimore, Maryland, and Wilmington, Delaware. Keep in mind that Baltimore and Jackson, Mississippi have 2 of some of the highest violent crime rates in the country. And we want to be able to compare the city of Houston to Wilmington, Delaware in a 2-part study. In the first phase, we want to be able to understand what these communities, what these neighborhoods look like in these areas where kids were more likely to possess guns. And we want to be able to compare those to areas where kids are not likely to possess guns and understand the socioeconomic conditions of those communities. In the second phase of this project, we want to be able to have conversations with kids who have been arrested for gun possession and ask them what it was that motivated them to possess guns. We are still in the first phase of the study. In this first phase, what we found out about these communities where kids are more likely to have guns in their possession, we found high rates of STDs, we found high rates of air pollution, we found an inordinate amount of single-parent households, we found food insecurities, these children are not getting enough sleep, we found high rates of residential segregation, We found housing insecurities. We found that there were fewer older adults that were able to serve as role models in these communities. We found more single parent, female run households. And we also found that ultimately in these communities, and this was shocking to me, you found low rates of suicide. And I want to have a conversation with you all later as we have a discussion about what is it about suicide and homicide that have an inverse relationship. Now, next slide, please. Now, we were listening to police around the country. And one of the realities that they told us was that they were having a hard time recruiting officers. They said that because of the increased accountability, because of the threat of losing qualified immunity, they were having problems recruiting qualified officers. And so we said, well, listen, why don't you tell us about the officers that you're recruiting and what's happening in the recruitment process and how you're losing them. We looked at police officer accountability. We looked at hiring practices. And what we found is that they don't necessarily have a problem recruiting officers. They have a problem retaining them after they reach the initial hiring process. What we found is if we look at the city of Houston, for example, of all of the applicants, what you're looking at is the percentage of that racial group that actually makes it through the hiring process, okay? So when you look, they're losing a lot of Black applicants, they're losing a lot of Latino applicants, but Black applicants tend to be the group that loses the most throughout the hiring process. We're working with HPD now to figure out why that's happening, because we understand that without a diverse police department, you're going to have problems in many of these communities. And something's happening throughout their hiring process. They're losing more Black applicants than any of the applicants across the board. Next PowerPoint, please. Now, we received a phone call from a parent said that, listen, my son is a student at one of the local high schools, and they are being penalized because they have long hair. And we reached out to the superintendent and said, listen, we received a phone call. We want to understand and help this parent understand what's happening to their child. And the superintendent said, listen, we have a policy in place that if a male student has long hair, then they can be penalized. They can be suspended, kicked out of school. And we said, listen, do you understand that a school suspension sends a kid down the negative path? And the superintendent said, yes, we understand that. And so we set up a series of meetings between the parents and the superintendent to work on this issue. Because what we wanted to know was if these policies were put in place for legitimate reasons. In other words, do these kids who have long hair, dreadlock hairstyles, are they more likely to be involved in delinquency? Do they have low grades? Or are there any substantive outcomes that would warn the school system from having these sorts of policies? And what we found that wasn't the case. We found no relationship between long hairstyles among male students and grades. We found no relationship between long hairstyles and student retention. We found no justifiable reason for suspending students because of their hairstyles that would warrant schools to doing this across the board. The Texas Supreme Court agreed in these cases, and they have outlawed suspending students because of these reasons across the board in the state of Texas. And we'll see what happens. The Supreme Court may pick up this case. We don't know just yet, but these are some of the policies that we worked on to begin to address some of these issues because we understand the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please. We understood that Texas was trying to pass its own version of the George Floyd Act. Representative Symphony Thompson was pushing this legislation, and we wanted to make sure that the state legislators had the information at their disposal to make the most warranted decision and pass a bill that would save lives in most cases. In working with these legislators, what we found out is that they disagreed on the contents of the bill. What we did as a research center, we provided them the research, and we allowed them to make calculated decisions about the bill relative to the research that we were able to provide for them moving forward. Next slide, please. We also saw a bail reform bill that we're not sure yet is going to be able to make it out and be passed because there's so much disagreement. Again, same approach we took with the George Floyd Act. We had the expert testimony in the Texas legislature over the last couple of weeks in Austin about the pluses and minuses of passing the bill in this regard. Again, this is a highly contentious bill. There is one group that assumes that if we are able to pass a bill in this regard, it's going to make significant differences. The opponents of that view feel that they're going to increase the number of violent offenders in the community. We're pushing for some sort of compromise between the two because we think it's there. Next slide, please. Another approach that we've taken is we provided a series of experts to local mayors, police chiefs, policymakers, and we wanted to be able to give them information that would help them improve policing. And here are the 8 areas that we've been able to do that in, because we know ultimately that police accountability and transparency is going to be the name of the game. We want to help them move that conversation forward. Next slide, please. One of the national conversations has been about defunding the police. We wanted to be able to provide information to policymakers on how to make best decisions about defunding the police. Now, here's the reality. We don't, as a research center, condone defunding the police, but we do support having a conversation about allocation of resources. And we want to be able to dispel all the myths and to be able to have an honest conversation about what defund the police is really about, so that ultimately the two parties that are disagreeing can come to the table and have a conversation about how they want to move the system forward. Next slide, please. This next project that we're working on is in conjunction with the Baylor College of Medicine. There is research out there that tells us that mothers who are pregnant are encountering structural racism, and that structural racism is affecting the health, the preterm health of their child, unborn child. And what we're looking at now is how structural racism in the city of Houston is impacting mothers' preterm birth complications. Because we understand that preterm birth complications and stress impact kids once they're born for a significant amount of time in their lives. We want to be able to understand that reality so we can help make sure that these kids' stress level and the outcomes of those are drastically reduced. Next slide, please. Here's a project that we worked on. We call it Saving Black Lives, and we understood that public defenders in many cases are the backbone of our criminal justice system. And they need the resources at their disposal to fight for the legal protections of many people who are unable to afford legal counsel. In this project, we looked at the benefits of having a culturally diverse legal representation and what that meant for a criminal justice system, particularly as we went through a pandemic, and being able to overlay the intersection of criminal justice, public health, and racial disparity across the country. In this report, we provide a series of recommendations. You can find it on our website that would help any locale understand the best approach to criminal justice reform during a pandemic. Next slide, please. We're in the process now of rolling out a series of focus groups. And the focus of these groups is to understand what people in the city of Houston think about police reform as they see it today. These are going to be a series of 5 focus groups spaced out around the city, so that we understand, as you've been through these last few months of this last year, pushing for hard police reforms, criminal justice reform, what does that mean to you? What recommendations can you provide the city of Houston? And how do we improve that space? And I hope you all can be engaged in that process, because we need diverse perspectives on the issue. Next slide, please. Coming out of this, I think, before we go to discussion, next slide, please. I think that, if we are able to understand what this is all about, if we launched this research center a couple of years ago in 2018, because we knew that if we were going to be able to make a difference, we need to be able to deal with the reality, a common set of facts, issues of race in this country. Being able to talk about the Black experience in Houston, in this state and around this country, must remain central to the work that we're able to do if we're going to have a country that's fair to all. to keep this work going, we need everyone, all of you, parents, teachers, business owners, students, neighbors, voters, and individuals from every background to be a part of this conversation of police reform and ultimately public safety reform. Reimagining policing is what we believe to be central to cities, to governments, to leaders at all levels in order to maintain public safety. And out of that, I think that we ultimately have ways in which we want to make sure that people are able to move forward. And our call to action is four-pronged. Number one, that we think that we need to acknowledge the historical legacy of race and class in American institutions and cultures. Number two, we must identify what works and what has been shown to work. Number three, we must implement community solutions. And what we mean by that is the solutions that are coming from the community that involve the community's input to make sure that they have some say-so in how they're dealt with by the criminal justice system, but also the broader society. But also we must remove what we call the mark of a criminal record. Just because someone has served time in prison, just because someone has been arrested doesn't mean that they are to be thrown away in our society. There are some valuable people, there's some great thinkers. There are some significant contributors to our conversation if we understand that people make mistakes and we have an opportunity and an obligation to make sure that they're able to provide a viable opportunity for success in our community. Ultimately, we believe if we don't do it together, we don't do it at all. And I think that we need to make sure that at the end of the day, we are doing it because we want people to be able to be successful because they're responsible for the next generation. I know that I may have gone over time, but I open the floor now to conversations. Again, we must be able to move and act if we're going to move this country in the right direction.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
I've got a question, and that is related to something you just said. How would you redefine the role of a police officer in Houston, for example?
Yeah, I think, ultimately, policing is, it has to change from a job that's focused on apprehension to one that's focused on public service. And I think that we have to remove the reward for punishment and apprehension to a reward of safety and protection, and one in which we deal with the solutions to problems. I think that we need to remove from the police's purview any of the work that's required of a social worker or a mental health official, because that's beyond the scope of work of a police officer. I think police have been asked to do too much. And I think that we need to be able to rein in just work. And I think in doing that, we can help them specialize in the space. But I think I'll also redefine it this way. I think that police officers should be required to have college degrees. If we're going to require college degrees of parole officers, if we're going to require college degrees of probation officers, if we're going to require college degrees of judges, we should require degrees of police officers, because ultimately they are the judges in the community and they represent our system of justice.
That's interesting. Thank you. And in terms of resource allocation, I guess what would happen is as opposed to defunding the police, it would just be reallocating funding towards some of these mental health services and community outreach.
Right. Yeah, no, I think so. Houston's trying to move in that direction. You have the Harris Center, you have the mayor coming out a few weeks ago pledging to provide more resources for the Houston Police Department to hire more mental health support. I think we now understand that there's a serious problem with mental health in our communities, and the police are not trained to deal with it. Ultimately, many of these individuals who have mental health challenges encounter the criminal justice system. We're going to have to reframe our thinking on that. Sort of the same way we reframed our thinking about drug problems. We recognize that the criminal justice system was not equipped to deal with drug problems. The system is not equipped to deal with mental challenges.
So what do you think the outlook is for Houston with regard to our having a brand new chief of police, Troy Finner? Do you think he's going to be receptive to
Yeah.
some of these reforms?
Yeah, I think so. I've had the opportunity to have conversations with him, serving on the mayor's police reform task force, and being able to understand his vision for the city. Him being a member from the city, it makes a difference, because I think he may have a perspective that's only unique to officers who are from the community. I think that he may need to push for more officers being from the city, working in the city, from the communities in which they were raised and grew up. I think that community policing, and they're calling it relational policing today, is critical to moving forward. You think about many of the laws that were put in place, many of the policies that were put in place. They were put in place, and they did not include perspectives of the people who were most likely to encounter them. And I think we need to reframe our thinking on that, and allow individuals to make decisions and to input their perspective on how they'll be policed. Because ultimately, the police work for the community, not just certain segments of the community, but the entire community.
Who else has a question that they'd like to ask? Marcella?
Yes, first of all, with great gratitude for the information that you're sharing, and
Yes.
much of the hope that sort of lives in me as I hear how people are moving towards attending to this. And my thought is, to the degree that I'm hearing you in a way, I'm interpreting what you're saying as there needs to be a concerted effort. It cannot just be the one section or the police. There's also legislation, there's school systems, and that makes it so overwhelming and big. So my specific question is, as we're attending to the pieces that are within our purview, within our sphere of influence, how is anyone thinking, or is there a group sort of thinking about coalescing or, stacking functions, like making it so that people are not trying to do what they can do specifically in their area, but rather is there, I guess I'm thinking about systems that allow for communication and influencing. So what's happening and what's being talked about within police realms are also being discussed and considered within educational realms, since there's a big tie-in to that and what's happening in community. So community centers, educational centers, etc. Are those being coordinated, or things are emerging organically? That was sort of my first question. What do you see happening on the ground?
I see two different schools of thought on that. The system is operating as it always has, because that's what it knows how to do, right? But then you have this nonprofit space, right? You have this philanthropic space that's trying to bring the systems together. The problem is the philanthropic space sometimes doesn't really understand how siloed the system has become. And so there is a need to be able to disentangle some of those silos and force them to work together. The problem is they've always been siloed, right? They don't know how to work together, right? So you take Harris County and you take the city of Houston. Sometimes they don't communicate, right? Even though they end up in the same space. There needs to be more concerted effort of these systems. I think that we're going to need corporations to begin to involve themselves in this space, because sometimes government can get kind of bloated and it becomes so bureaucratic that they can't really make decisions in real time. But I also think that there's a need for truth and reconciliation commissions on a local level. I think that there needs to be groups of people who come together who understand the challenges in that particular city and to develop localized solutions to problems, because what may be necessary for the city of Houston may not necessarily work in Sugar Land, right? Or may not necessarily work in Galveston or in Dallas. I think there's some local realities that people need to work together to fix. And unfortunately, the institutions, the criminal justice systems, the housing system, they haven't traditionally had conversation with each other, right? And they're very territorial. And so I think that ultimately we understand that, and we need to focus on breaking that up, and so that they can reform a system that is truly a system and not separate fiefdoms.
Yeah, I agree. And having lived much of my life in the educational system, I also noticed that not only are they traditionally siloed from other parts of the society, but they're also have a strong inertia. That means change comes very, very slowly. So even within the system, there's like this very slow moving piece. So if I have that in mind, we had a guest speaker, Angela Blanchard, who's dealt with disasters. So Houston coming together in the case of disasters, right? How the different organisms, like both governmental, non-governmental, individuals, like at all those different levels, people coming together to attend to the problem. Like a part of me is thinking, why do we have to wait for like those kind of disasters and emergencies when this in itself is also an emergency in the way I perceive it, but it doesn't have that immediacy. And it also feels like very big. Whereas it's easy for me individually to think I can lend a blanket and or provide support individually, and I can also support local organizations to do something. There's something about the short term that allows people's willingness to do something about it is higher when it's short term. When you're talking about changing systems, it's like, oh, well, it's always been that way. So again, I'm going back to my original question of, given that there are already people working on everything that you've mentioned, and I'll use the concrete example that you gave. So for example, if everybody agrees that it's a good idea for police officers to have a college degree, what steps would be necessary to make that happen? If the different bodies agree that it makes sense, like in that sense, wanting to see what is possible to do if something is agreed upon, enough agreement is found that, oh yeah, so how do we go about making this happen? Like, what would your recommendation be to making this happen? What steps? Who gets to, who gets a knock on the door?
I think when you become top heavy in the system, you have too many directors, you have too many chiefs, right? And if we're looking at a system of justice, I think there needs to be one person who directs the energies of all the parts. And what has happened is the system has created its own ego. And you have these sub-egos in the system that are fighting for recognition and prestige as opposed to effectiveness and outcomes. I think ultimately you have a system that has been created that is focused on maintaining itself more so than attempting to be so effective that it's no longer necessary. And we have not done a good job of allowing people to focus on a system where we should be focusing on individual accountability and the ability to be okay with envisioning a world where there's no need for a criminal justice system. I don't think we really believe that. I think we are the belief that the system is always necessary, that it's always necessary to hire more police, that we need more district attorneys, that we need more prisons. That's the problem, because we have not envisioned what it would look like to have a world where police are not necessary, where it's not necessarily have crime. We don't believe it. And because we don't believe it, I think subconsciously we subvert all of our conscious decisions to make change. How do we do that? The second part of your question, the last part of the question. Again, I think that we need to develop one objective and solve that problem and move to the next. We spread ourselves so thin, we're dealing with multiple issues. We're dealing with the opioid crisis. We're dealing with rising violent crime. We're dealing with domestic violence. We're dealing with police corruption. We're dealing with an inability to respect individuals based upon their race, their social class, their gender, their sexual orientation. We haven't grappled with those well yet. We haven't solved problems. We've just allowed them to linger on. And until we create a hierarchy of importance of issues, we're going to continue to spread ourselves thin.
And how do you initiate or accomplish change in light of a strong police union? How do you break through that potential barrier?
Yeah, I think you're going to need to continue to apply community pressure on elected officials. Because, when you look at, for example, chokeholds, when you look at no-knock warrants, when you look at holding police officers accountable, duty to intervene, elected officials recognize what the community was saying needed to be done in those spaces, and they pass policies to make that change. We haven't been that way about police unions. We've been very slow to have a conversation about them because unions and qualified immunity are necessary collectively to exist. But we don't deal with that. I think there needs to be a national and a local educational campaign about the role of unions in these spaces. And also police officers don't think they can exist without them. And so they seem to be critical to their existence. And we haven't done a good job of educating folks about their role in all of this dysfunction in our criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. Marta, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Yes, I wanted to ask a follow-up question really to the ideas around relational and community policing. It seems like it must be very challenging in a place like Harris County in Houston, where the police have to really rely on their car. I mean, I've lived in other cultures, for example, in England, where the police walk around the streets and they really are in the community, but I've never experienced that in Houston. Is it different in other places, or it seems like the car is king, so to speak? And I think, in my opinion, that helps create barriers.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. A lot of what we experience on the negative end of it is cultural, right? We accept it, right? We expect it. You take Camden, New Jersey, for example. They totally created a new police force, right? They've gotten out of the cars. They begin to walk around the community. They've taken a public health, community-oriented approach, mental health approach, social work approach to policing. They've seen reductions in violent crime. They've seen reductions in all crime. They've seen police shootings go to zero, right? So we have examples in the United States where cities have taken the approach that you're talking about, and they've shown to be effective. The problem is, as Liz mentioned, the role of the union in these spaces is to propagate the status quo, because that's how they maintain their power. I think we're going to have to figure out how to convince unions that they can also be as powerful in transforming our systems to something that's more amenable to public health and safety.
How did Houston fare in that research you did that lined up Houston with Baltimore and Jackson, and I forget the fourth city?
Yeah, well, no, you're fine. I think so. We're in the first phase of that research, but Houston, relatively speaking, is doing pretty well. And I know that's contrary to popular narrative, but when you look at our crime rates relative to other cities' crime rates, we're lower than many cities that are much smaller than us. When you look at violent crime, for example, some have us ranked at 11, 13, some have us as low as 21, depending upon the type of violent offense that you're talking about. In none of those cases are we number one. In none of those cases are we 1, 2, 3, or 4. And statistically, we should be around 3rd or 4th on all categories, but that's not the case. And so that tells us that something's happening here that's buffering that reality. And again, it's contrary to popular narrative.
Do you think some of that has to do with how spread out Houston is, how extensive it is? We're not living in a real dense circumstance.
Yeah, I think geography has a lot to do with it, but I also think that access to employment has a lot to do with it as well. Mm-hmm. Houston has jobs that many cities don't have. They have opportunities that many cities don't have. We also have extensive access to medical care. We have access to higher education. We have access to trade schools, and that makes a difference. When people have opportunities and options, the opportunity for crime diminishes. And I think that Houston has a way to show the rest of the country that there are some things that we do right here. And I hate to take always, I don't like taking the negative view of the city, because I think there are a lot of positive angles that the city can show the rest of the world. Because I mean, relatively speaking, it should be more violent here. There should be more crime victims, but somehow because of these factors that I just mentioned, Houston's been able to refrain from having that reality.
That's really interesting. Marcella, had an interesting comment about restorative circles. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, briefly, trying to bridge the different sort of components of society. We had in the previous guest was someone who's been incorporating and bringing restorative circles based on restorative justice practices around conflict engagement and building community and trust. And particularly as a proposal for attending to the polarization that exists in ways of thinking and paradigms that we have. And it felt so naturally right. And I was curious if you've heard of restorative justice circles and or practices.
Yeah, I have. I think, when you think about any sort of opportunity to bring people together who understand the need to allow people to re-enter society effectively without the mark of a criminal record, we're going to be the better for it. I mean, let's listen. The city of Houston on any given year returns upwards of 6,000 people coming from prison. You can't function with that many people coming from prison without giving people opportunities. It just doesn't happen. There are jobs that need people coming out of prison. When we talk to employment companies and agencies, they tell us, listen, these guys and girls coming out of prison are some of our best workers. That's a reality. That's a fact. And I think the more that we can bring people back into the fold of society, the better off we are. I mean, it's dangerous to have people around who are not a part of civic engagement, right? We understand what that does. And I think we need to find the fastest way we can acclimate people to society. Some of these people are good. Some of these folks are good people. They're good, hardworking people. They may have been born in the wrong community. They may have been born into a family that led them down the way. They may have chosen the wrong friends. Many of them have mental health issues. There are very few people out there who just choose to be delinquent because they ultimately want to. Most folks have some condition that led them down the path. And I think if we provide an opportunity to straighten it out, I think we will be much better for that.
No, I mean, and that is absolute. And I saw, Jerry, that you had, so I'll just finish this and I'll pass it on to you. I think the sort of meta lens around
go ahead.
Is that we ourselves can assess and reflect on the society that we want to have based on how we treat the least of our brethren, kind of thing. Like, to the degree that we welcome people back who want to be integrated. And the last thing I'll say is that in the way I was holding restorative circles was more for youth, like to actually prevent as opposed to in response to. They promised me. But yeah, so thank you so much. And Jerry, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to step into this because I was really struck by the presentation of all of the presentations, but last week, turning kids into criminals within the school system. And I don't understand if there is a way, and I'm sure there must be, with some vision to bring the lessons from people who have responded to prison. And they've come out to be very productive. As much as society will allow them to be, is there a way to incorporate those people into our public school system to help students who, for whatever reason, are not responding to the discipline or able to respond to the discipline? I'm not talking about punishment, but that day-to-day discipline of getting up in the morning and eating, getting dressed, washing your hair, whatever, whatever kinds of discipline that we can put into their lives, and to have happen. If we had former prisoners mentoring, looking at what they were in prison for, but so often it's for nothing or very little.
No, No, I agree. I think that we need more mentoring programs. The problem now is that our society has become so sensitive to liability that we have taken away role models that we normally would have in a community. I think that the task is so daunting for school systems that they don't know how to deal with it because we've separated them from the community. My kids' school, we have a mentoring program where lots of kids go and spend a day in the school and they meet with the kids, and the kids get a chance to see different dad every day of the year. And that makes a difference because they see role models. And I think in many of these communities, we should do the same thing. And you're right. I think people who have been through the system and have been able to work their way through successfully are some of the greatest role models. And it's going to take leadership to recognize the influence that a person can have on someone who's been through the path that these kids may be going through if they don't straighten out. And I think that we've become so detached, that we've become so tied to our cell phones and text messages and social media that we've forgotten that the human interaction, that one-on-one contact is more powerful than anything you could ever read or find on your cell phone. But I agree with you. It's just going to take the bold leadership to take us back full circle to the day in which human interaction was key. Everyone attempts to bowl alone, and that doesn't work too well.
Jerry, did you have something else?
I'm thinking back for about 5 or 6 years in the 2008 or 2006 to 2012. I taught as an adjunct at University of Houston downtown. And thinking about all those students, I taught storytelling and beginning public speaking. And it was so interesting to have these really diverse, where you had kids from adults and kids from Africa, the Mideast, Turkey, and downtown Houston. You had former gang members. This whole, you had people that when I first started, it was open enrollment. So you had high school kids that hadn't learned to put sentences together, and to see them respond as the people in the class mentored one another. Because when I first started teaching, I had no idea how to do this. So I threw myself on the mercy of the students and said, and then that became my kind of a style. What can we do together? How can we work through this curriculum together? And how can we develop thinking skills?
Yeah, I think one of the notes I mentioned in the presentation was community rooted, and what you did was you used the collective to help bring together the minds and the solutions to the problem. And I think that's what we've gotten away from. We create a system whereby individuals in positions of power are making decisions for everyone else. And we need to get back to all of these groups of people being at the table to devise solutions, because there's no way, for example, a group of men are going to make decisions for a group of women and it'd be effective. And I think that you need to have everyone at part of this conversation to devise solutions, because they're just perspectives that you're not going to get unless you've been in that position's shoes. And I think what you're talking about is good old fashioned education. And we got to get back there. There's some things that technology can't recreate. And this is one of those situations where we found ourselves at the mercy of evolution. And we need to take a pause and understand that there are some good realities that we've moved on from that we need to take ourselves back to.
Switching gears just a little bit, I've been so concerned about the Texas legislature's passage or imminent passage of this permitless constitutional carry law that I believe the governor's going to sign into law today or tonight. What do you have any statistics on gun ownership in Houston or Harris County, and how that breaks out by population? I feel like all of these white people are trying to arm themselves against some sort of Armageddon, and I don't know where that, I mean, I know it's fear-based, but what is going on?
I think it's anger.
So let me say this. Yeah, it's anger, but it's also fear.
It is.
Right? It's fear that someone's going to take over this space. Someone's going to run in their home and take over their home and their land. And so let me say this. Houston has more gun shows per capita, more gun shops per capita than any city in the country. Okay, let's just start there. Okay, because you have to say, well, you don't have gun shows and you don't have gun shops where people aren't buying, right? So obviously the fear is very great here, and we understand that. Now let's talk about this gun possession piece for a second. We understand that 30% of any community possesses guns, right? So it's not even a majority, but they also tend to be the loudest in the community, right? Most folks don't own guns. Most folks could care less about a gun. They go to work, no one breaks in their house, they're not in fear of anybody taking their gun. And most folks who own a gun own a handgun, which is totally illogical because you rarely will ever use it. Now, here's the interesting piece. Gun ownership is far more common in Republicans than Democrats. And you say, well, you know, why is there party affiliation with gun ownership? Okay, explain that, and we could talk about that. But there's something happening there. There's a fear there. There's an illusion that that gun is going to protect them, right? Almost half of non-gun owners could see themselves owning a gun in the future, right? So we're talking potential, right? And protection is listed as number one reason why a person owns a gun. But here's the scary part. Most gun owners own multiple guns. So they don't just have one, they have 2, 3, 4, and 5. Your guess is as good as mine. Why do you need more than one? You only see people shoot 2 guns in the old Western movies, and they don't make those anymore. Okay, now here's the interesting part. The research tells us that about half of US adults grew up in a gun-owning household. So we got tradition we're battling as well, okay? We're battling what we know as customary. But among those that grew up with guns, men are far more likely than women to have participated in certain gun-related activities when they were young. And so that's about training, acculturation, learned behavior. Men on average become gun owners much earlier than women. And just think about that for a moment. But about 7 in 10 Americans say they've ever fired a gun, which is a little scary if you think about it. Now, 6 in 10 Americans say people in their community have a positive view of gun, which speaks to the broader societal acceptance of the gun. But I think at the end of the day, we're dealing with a culture that was founded in gun possession, and it's just going to be very difficult for us to shoot back against that, particularly when it keeps being used as a political tool to basically get people to accept certain ways of life that we need to get rid of. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it's helpful.
No, I'm loving the question because I remember I had forgotten how upset I was when I heard the news. But what gave me some hope is I remember was it last year, I think, or a couple of years ago, when there were actually this idea of acculturation in history, the idea that we were similar to Australia, and that Australia's relationship with guns had a lot of similarity, and the way that they went about, you know, I mean, and that's what it would require, the will of the majority to sort of mobilize. And at the same time, I'm imagining that small group, that very loud and vocal group you spoke of, being so touched and so threatened by any conversation that would require them giving up some gun rights, that it's just difficult to, you know, yeah. Whew, that's a big topic, but thank you for touching on it.
Let me say this if I can, because I think the question is what's happening with the guns. Looking at international comparison, and thanks for raising that point. But let me say this: when you compare the United States to England, Wales, Canada, Australia, 73% of all homicides in the United States are at the hands of a gun. 73%. The next closest is Canada with 39%. Okay, so a little more than 7 out of 10 homicides in the United States are gun related. And almost 4 out of 10 in Canada are gun related. Canada's the next closest. Okay, so these guns are being used obviously to kill a significant swath of people in this country. Now, let's look at gun ownership in relationship to other countries. For every 100 residents, every 100 firearm residents, okay, there are in the United States 120 guns. I'll say it again. For every 100 gun-owning homes in the United States, there are 120 guns in those homes. So you have more guns than homes in people. So people are owning multiple guns. The next closest country is Yemen with 60 for every 100. Now, how does that work out? That means you have homes in Yemen that support gun ownership that may have had a gun before but no longer have a gun, okay? But in the United States, if they support gun ownership, they have multiple guns in those homes, right? This has become part of our culture that we cannot seem to get away from. Now, here's the other piece that I'll throw out there to you all. When you look at mass shootings since 1991 and the number of people killed, Las Vegas has almost hit 60 people killed. Las Vegas. Orlando, you're just under 50. We're talking about in one city at a time. We're talking about who supports guns, what they're using them for, the attitudes toward gun possession. And we're not just talking about handguns, we're talking about assault weapons. We're talking about a mindset that we have to deal with here. And until we deal with the mindset, then we're going to have this problem. We have to get people to think differently about these issues. How nonsensical it is to own not only a gun, but multiple guns. And I think that we have to deal with that. But when you have people in positions of power who are supporting that, I mean, they're talking about allowing gun possession on college campuses. I mean, the danger of that. I mean, can you imagine? Having I'm sorry, Jerry, what do you saying?
I said, well, they already have that. You have to keep it
Yeah,
concealed.
exactly.
But
I think you keep it concealed, right? And open carry.
yeah.
Can you imagine a gun in the possession of a kid who thinks an F is the end of the world? Right? Can you imagine a gun on a kid in the classroom where other kids have guns? Right? It's a disaster waiting to happen. And for some reason, we can't get our policymakers to understand that. And particularly in the South, very interesting, which is a very gun supporting culture, that we have not been able to disentangle the reality and gun possession. So
Pivoting over a little bit to the police force, you mentioned something in an earlier conversation about gunshot cameras that the police utilize here in Houston. Did I hear that right from your earlier?
Yeah, you did. Yes. Can you hear me now? Okay. So, there's new technology that they're using in the city and around other cities around the country where they can detect the presence of a gunshot, how far away that gunshot occurred, so that they can begin to focus on and narrow in on where these gunshots are taking place and hopefully apprehend these guns, get them off the street. I think the city of Houston needs more technology because as unemployment continues to plummet in many communities, as the pandemic continues to, hopefully we're going in the right direction now, it seems. But there for a while, we were going in a very dark place, and violent crime is through the roof. We just don't know how much more of that we're going to have. But technology needs are great. But I think Houston has stepped up to the plate, and they've been able to implement technology that's going to make a difference in helping gun violence around the city.
Use a gun? Can their guns be taken away from them?
No, so and that's a very subjective. That's a very subjective question. It kind of depends on who you are, and what you're doing with it. Hopefully, people who aren't registered don't get those guns back. The problem is many of them buy guns on the black market, and many guns that are purchased legally end up in the black market. I don't know what we can do about that, but I think we have to change this John Wayne mentality that we have in this country about guns and why they're necessary.
Who else has a question? So I'll just say, you mentioned the legislative efforts at the state level to pass what now seems to be portions of the George Floyd Act that Symphonia Thompson had proposed, and now she's sort of breaking it up into smaller bites, I guess. What about, as opposed to the state level, at the city level, we had the police reforms that were proposed to Mayor Turner, and recently I read that he decided to adopt the majority of those. Are you happy with that decision and how that's worked out?
Yeah, I think so. I was glad to see the mayor do that because it's easier for him to make changes if he can than to take them to Austin and try to get the entire state to adopt them. It's much less red tape. There are some recommendations that we made as a committee that the mayor can't change. But I think in terms of dealing with no-knock warrants, in terms of dealing with duty to intervene, in terms of dealing with chokeholds, he has an opportunity, and I think his statements have been in support of that. I think him adopting our recommendation to release body camera footage within 30 days was a great move. Because a lot of times people just need to see what's happening, right? And I think if people can see what's happening in real time, it cuts down on social frustration. If you look and you don't see the same types of riots that you see around the country in Houston, which is a good thing, which means that there's some level of communication between the police and the community. As long as we continue that, the rest of the country, you've seen serious rioting in places like Chicago, Detroit, all over the country. But you haven't seen that same sort of rioting in Houston. I think there's a nice collection of people who are all looking for reforms and how best to get there. You've seen a lot of resistance from Austin, though. And I think many of the state legislators are not really supportive of reforms that you may see in many of these urban communities, but I think they're necessary.
Of course, there's Austin as the state capital, and then there's Austin, the city, where the legislators are, has Austin, the city, in their sights because they, I guess, for a variety of reasons, including budgetary, are sending less money toward the police. So they're accusing them of defunding. And there's some pretty draconian, results that this new bill that they're trying to pass would place on a city like that.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think, it's unfortunate that cities are not able to govern themselves as they should and they want to. I think that if a city and its population to make improvements for the better that are going to protect public safety, but also reduce racial and ethnic disparities, I think they should be able to move in that direction. But I think we've been able to see here in Texas the political posturing, and oftentimes not for the better, that we have a situation where we will have a natural experiment to be able to see how effective these implementations are over the next couple of years.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left. Does anybody have any further questions?
Okay.
I want to make a comment. I'm so glad you all.
Then I'll speak up at once.
all the seminar together, and all four of them. This has been really eye-opening. I read the papers and I try to keep up, but just meet people who are actively involved, and like Dr. Henderson, to find out about the Houston Independent newspaper, all the disasters and the people trying to create forward thinking about, getting ahead of the next disaster instead of waiting for the end. It's like waiting for the end of a marriage before you call the forces for it. But I really enjoyed hearing you, Dr. Henderson, and all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. I think if I could leave and with anything, I think this is an opportunity to end a lot of challenges and issues that we've dealt with for a long time. I think we need to have a vision beyond police, right? I think it's a bigger issue than just the police. And I think that we need to be able to galvanize our questions around equity and the sanctity of life and human rights. And I think that ultimately there will be just one mechanism that we do that. But I think that we need to be able to come together to reimagine what it's like for people to be treated as equal. And I think through doing that, we would be able to address many of the harms that we've encountered, because ultimately this country is an experiment. And we often lose sight of that. And we're not going to be perfect. There are going to be people who are mistreated. Our job is to figure out how as fast as we can to implement everyone into the fold of this society. And I think we can do that if we have conversations and we have honest conversations with each other about how we feel, about how we see the world, and who we're leaving out, and listen to reason and science, and respect people regardless of whatever political party they may be a part of or not. And I think that we can do it through continued conversation. So I thank you all for bringing me here, because I think the Houston Seminar is a great opportunity for people to learn about a myriad of ideas and experiences and solutions to many problems that we face. And I think being able to end the conversation on a positive note with solutions, I think is the way to go. So again, my hat off to you all for putting this together, and know that you have a fan in me from now on. Thank you.
Well, we are just endlessly grateful to you, Howard, for your taking the time to educate us about this important topic and to share with us your data and your experiences. And we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And you all stay safe, stay dry, and enjoy the rest of your week.
All right, you do the same. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.